I stared at a dead woman on a cold metal table. Not a slab, like in the movies, but a table. In the movies, the dead woman was usually played by an actress. Usually she would be naked or covered up with a clean white sheet. She would be a live person, pretending to be dead. She would be painted in white makeup to make her look lifeless. This was no actress. Nothing looked fake. No white makeup painted on her. There were no prosthetic scars or fake bruises or rubbery black eyes. The woman I looked at was very dead. In life, her name had been Karen Decker. Someone murdered her. But first, they'd beaten her nearly to death with a hammer. The FBI had arrested a guy. They arrested him for killing 3 other women. He was in jail for it. He was on death row for it. But the person who killed her wasn't the same guy they had on death row, which made people start to doubt that the guy they had arrested nearly 2 years earlier for a series of similar murders was guilty. How could he kill Karen Decker if he was locked up? The guy they had on death row had been convicted of killing a series of women, in the same manner, hammer and all, following the same M.O., torturing them in the same exact ways, and all for the same apparent reason: military desertion. He had killed a series of women because they had all supposedly gone AWOL. Karen Decker's broken body was bruised and blunted and pulped, nearly beyond recognition. As I stared over her, I noticed that her captor hadn't bothered to restrain her arms, and he hadn't bothered because he had broken them both at the elbows. No need to tie her up. Her bashed, shattered elbows had made fighting back impossible. I stopped looking over her for a moment and closed my eyes. I imagined the killer. I tried to put myself in his shoes. I tried to forget who I was, that I was a good guy. I tried to think like a depraved murderer. I imagined all the horrible, gut-wrenching things that the killer could have done with her, with a hammer. A surplus of gruesome images flashed through my brain. I imagined my facial expressions winced in response to each of them, but I kept my eyes shut. I watched them all. Finally, I opened my eyes and stared back down at her. I ticked off each of the horrifying acts that I had imagined an insane psycho could do. Not one of the horrible things on my list had been missed by this killer. He had done just about everything sickening that a man could do with a hammer, and a helpless, kidnapped victim. It was all out of a bad nightmare. The killer had used the hammer to shatter her elbows, bust her kneecaps, pulverize her toes into mush, and pummel her lower face and jaw to pulp. It looked like most of her bones in her arms and legs were crushed to sawdust under the skin. Decker's teeth were gone from her mouth, but they were in the room with us. They were trodden and shattered into cracked small pieces and souped into a tin bowl next to her head. Her body had been found in the water. She had washed up on shore, which made me wonder how they found her teeth. So I asked the medical examiner, who was just an army physician. I asked, "Was she washed up by the tide?" "Right," he said. "Where did you find her teeth?" "They were in her mouth." "They looked like they were bashed out." "The killer stuffed them back in her mouth." I recoiled and said, "He put them back?" "Looks that way." "Why?" The doctor shrugged. "Guess he wanted to make sure that we could identify her." "Why?" I asked again. Again he shrugged. The killer had smashed her teeth apart, and the medical examiner had put them out for us to see. I didn't ask why he displayed them like that, because I figured it was standard operating procedure for army doctors. Despite the enormous damage that the killer had done to this poor woman, He left her forehead and scalp unscathed. The skin above her eyebrows was undamaged, as was her hair, all except the damage done by seawater in the Atlantic currents. The killer had stopped at her eyes and nose. I didn't have to ask the doctor why. I knew why. He had done this because he didn't want to kill her with the hammer. He'd wanted her to stay alive. He wanted her to know how she was going to die. He wanted her to feel it. I felt my stomach wrench at the sight of her. I never knew Karen Decker. She had been a soldier, and I'd been a Navy SEAL. But she was still my sister. We were still a part of the military family. All soldiers were my family. The same goes for the Marines, airmen, and sailors. I tried to ignore the intense pain that Decker had endured for a moment, and I focused on the question of how. How could someone lure her onto a boat and to her death like that? I imagined the kinds of scenarios that would require her to be tricked. The possibilities were endless. But essentially, the gist of them all boiled down to two basic possibilities. She either knew the killer, trusted him, and allowed herself to be vulnerable, or she'd been abducted against her will, probably at gunpoint. It was most likely the latter was the case. That was how all the other women had been murdered. I opened my eyes again. The Army doctor had been standing there with me and one of the FBI agents that I came in with. The doctor had been speaking, talking to the FBI agent, ignoring me. He'd been describing the killing in detail, like a Shakespearean student who'd stayed up all night studying a monologue. Now he was reciting it to us. I didn't care about most of what he was saying. I tuned it out until he said, "Her assailant pounded on her elbows, shattering the bones." No shit, I thought. I closed my eyes and imagined a blacksmith hammering smoldering metal on an anvil. I imagined him wailing away at it, bending and shaping it into the desired specifications of the object that he was creating. I imagined the sparks flying and spraying into tiny particles of dust and fire. But the killer hadn't been a blacksmith. Blacksmiths created things. This killer wasn't creating, but subduing, demolishing a person's life. Both her arms were stretched out and laid by her sides as natural as they could have been. And they still looked awkward, like a mangled plastic mannequin. They told me that she was found on a more remote part of Cocoa Beach, a point that was still used for surfing by the locals. But she had floated there for up to 24 hours before she was found. Her body had been washed up after a storm that I had also been in. It turned out that she had been found this morning only 3 miles from where I had been standing, 24 hours ago, on a deserted beach. Decker had been killed by a high-velocity 9mm bullet that burst through her head and ricocheted around in her brain pan, ripping through tissue and cracking the inside of her skull. 3 days earlier, Army Corporal Karen Decker had gone missing from the Cocoa Beach area. 1 minute she was there, and the next she was gone. She had been a surfer, like me. I would say that she was much more into it than I was. I'd only done it recreationally, maybe once or twice a year. According to her friends, Decker had seen it as a way of life. On the last day that anyone had seen her alive, she had gone out to surf, alone. Apparently, that hadn't been that unusual for her. However, she was known for being a true professional soldier. She never missed a day of work. She always called if she had to be away, that sort of thing. But the day she went surfing, she never returned home. The next morning, she didn't show up for work. After she was deemed missing, the Army MPs had started to search for her. It was a short-lived search. A major mistake on the part of the Army, in my opinion. They immediately jumped the gun. Within a few days, they started to believe that she'd gone AWOL. The MP's reasoning behind this was because there was evidence that she wasn't happy about her new assignment. She had been stationed in South Florida and loved it, but now they were taking that away from her. She had been given an assignment to return to a tour in Iraq as a part of the first all-women combat convoy to enter into ISIS-controlled areas. The whole thing sounded like a PR act of desperation on the part of the Army. I figured that Decker saw this too. She probably was insulted by it. On the surface, the appearance of what happened was that Decker abandoned her post. She had already spent 2 tours in Iraq, way back during the height of the war. Once she returned stateside, she was quite vocal against it. I had learned that she wasn't willing to go back. She desperately tried to get out of orders to return to the Middle East a few times. She'd even written all over her social media her distaste for our current deployments in the Middle East, not as an ideological thing, but more out of an anger that the Army was being wasted there. I could see her contempt for the politicians in Washington, and the 4-stars in the Pentagon who once had been warriors and now were glorified pencil pushers. Her words, not mine. But Karen Decker never made it to her deployment. She never made it to work. She never even made it home from the beach because she was murdered. I looked back down at her. She had 2 swollen eyes, black, lifeless, but opened, unnaturally opened because they had been beaten shut. To open them up, the doctor had sliced through the swollen lids right down the middle. I had asked him why, and he told me it was to see if there was any evidence in them. He was concerned that the killer was playing games, because of the teeth, I imagined. But there wasn't any evidence in the eye sockets. The doctor had also mentioned that he had planned to sew them shut before releasing the body to the family for what he called a proper burial. The last piece of physical evidence was that there was bruising left behind the ear that indicated that the killer had pressed the muzzle of the 9mm handgun back there, and hard, too. He'd pressed it behind the ear, right side, then pulled the trigger. A single shot. That was the only variation from the other dead women. Everything else was the same. Remarkably so. It was an execution, no doubt. The doctor said, "He really hated her." Why do you say that? He stared at me like I was a monster for even asking the question, but the reason I asked was to get his take on it. "Isn't it obvious? This was done out of hate, out of rage. Look at what he put her through." I nodded. Still, I wasn't quite convinced. Sure, it looked bad, but there was something calculated about it, like a planned mess. And there was something else. I had seen a lot of dead people in my time in the Naval Criminal Investigative Services. I'd seen a lot of lifeless corpses and lifeless eyes. But her eyes were different. Something was wrong in them. I couldn't quite explain it. It was like she'd been shocked and surprised by what was coming at her, which could have been what they all had felt. But this was more. I didn't know what to make of it. Not yet. I looked over at the Army doctor and asked, "Any physical evidence that's different with her from the others?" "No. I'd say that her experience was long, drawn-out suffering, same as the rest. I've been in the Army for 10 years now. I've seen some combat in Iraq, 3 tours and a stretch in Frankfurt. We got a lot of guys there, a lot of hopeless cases. So I've seen tons of guys flown back from that war. I've seen missing limbs, gunshot wounds, IEDs, you name it. But I've never seen a single soldier endure torture like this."